Hi. My first video was pretty well received, so I thought I'd make another one. But I think I should make it a lot shorter than I did that last one. 40 minutes was probably a little bit ridiculous. So I chose a game that I played 3 Thursdays ago at the Worcester Chess Club against a guy named Mike Odell. His rating is 2080, I think, so almost 2100. Very strong player, in my opinion. And he had the black pieces, I had the white ones. I played d4. He played knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3. And those of you who saw my last video, or who are familiar with chess in general, will understand that Mike's third move, d5, signals a defense called the Grunfeld. And in the main line of this opening, white takes on d5, black plays knight takes d5, and after e4, knight c3, bc3, bishop g7. White has a very big pawn center, but black, in typical hypermodern fashion, is going to try to put a lot of pressure on that pawn center, using his pawns, his minor pieces, his heavy pieces, with the idea of either breaking down the center or forcing white to advance it in a way that's disadvantageous. But I chose something different here. I played knight f3, and after bishop g7 I played queen b3, entering what's called the Russian variation of the Grunfeld defense. And white's idea here is very similar. After black plays d takes c4, which is normal, and castles kingside, white plays e4. And this is very similar to the normal Grunfeld, except for a couple things. One is that white's b pawn is still on b2. It did not make its way to c3, which means that white's center is not as big as it would be otherwise. But what white has in exchange for that is the fact that black has not successfully traded off a pair of knights. And as I mentioned last time, when you have a space disadvantage, a reasonable way to try to lessen the disadvantage is to trade off some pieces. Basically, if you have fewer squares than your opponent does, the more pieces you have trying to maneuver around on those squares, the more they're going to step on each other's toes, and the less likely it is that you'll be able adequately to respond to your opponent's threats. Okay, so we followed theory for a while. He played a6, bishop e2, b5, queen b3, bishop b7, e5, knight d5, and castle kingside. Knight takes c3, queen takes c3, and I realize I'm kind of blitzing through these moves, but I really want to stick to my commitment to making this a shorter video than the last one. Hopefully 10 or 15 minutes long. Black played knight d7. Alright, and we've reached a position that I think is important because it's the late opening or early middle game, and it's a time when both players should be looking at the position, trying to figure out what it offers them that they can exploit. White has more space thanks to his e5 and d4 pawns, and black has what's called an outpost on d5. An outpost is a square that can no longer be attacked by any of your opponent's pawns. So there's no white pawn on the c-file, and his pawn on the e-file has already advanced past the e4 square, which means white has no way to use a pawn to attack d5. And the way that an outpost is typically exploited is that the guy trying to exploit it brings a lot of his pieces to bear on that square. The bishop from b7 is staring at d5, the knight can head over to b6, where it'll be looking at d5, and black can use the d-file to control d5 with his heavy pieces. And eventually he'll occupy that square, he'll try to make the position really solid, let's say, and then the fact that he owns a square that white can never attack with a pawn, he hopes in the long run will give him an advantage. So I thought I had better play energetically here. I don't want the game to go on for long enough that my weakness on d5 comes back to haunt me. So I played the move e6. And this is a very common move in hypermodern openings. Whenever you see a black knight on d7, and a pawn on f7, a white pawn on e5, and nothing on the e6 square. And the idea is that even though it looks like white's just losing a pawn, because black can play f takes e6, the pawn that he wins is a doubled isolated pawn, along with its partner on the e-file. And it is for that reason very easy to attack using all of white's pieces. Also, the fact that his pawn is no longer on f7 means that black is now much weaker than he was a second ago on the central and kingside light squares. Okay. Mike chose to play knight to b6, which is consistent with his plan to make use of this d5 square. I took on f7 with check, and after rook takes f7, put my knight on a more advanced outpost with tempo, hitting this rook on f7. Mike played rook f6. I continued to attack with queen h3, which accomplishes two goals. One is hitting this h7 pawn, which means it comes with tempo. And the second is that it gets out of the way of knight d5, which otherwise would have hit the queen on c3. After queen h3, Mike played the natural h6, and I retreated my knight to f3, which looks like a concession, but is not really. And that's because now that there's a pawn on h6, if I attack it with my dark squared bishop and my queen, it's difficult for black to defend. I think at this point black had to try the move g5, which looks weakening, but which is much better than what he played in the game. He played king h7, and this defends the h6 pawn, but unfortunately undefends the g5 square. And that's because the white queen is pinning the h6 pawn to the king on h7, which means that this g5 square is not currently guarded by anything. The most tempting move right off the bat is knight g5 check, right? Because it's a check. But unfortunately, black can just go back to g8, and then we have just repeated the position, and I can go back to f3. But there's no guarantee that black is going to move his king back to h7. So instead, I decided to develop my dark squared bishop with tempo, bishop to g5. Mike moved his rook over to d6, putting more pressure on the d4 pawn. And I thought, well, okay, I got my bishop to g5 with tempo, but if I can get it away from that square with tempo to somewhere else where it's a decent piece, then I once again have g5 for my knight, which might be beneficial. So I put my bishop back on f4, hitting the rook on d6 again. I think black's already in pretty big trouble here, but what Mike played is a blunder. He played the move rook to d7. And this allows a nice game-winning tactic in knight g5 check. Black's h-pawn is pinned to his king, so there's no h takes g5, which means the king has to move. And if it goes to h8, knight f7 check wins the queen on d8. And if it goes to g8, the move queen to e6 check wins the game, either directly with queen f7 checkmate, or in a little bit, in a way that's going to take a little bit longer, with knight f7 check, once again winning the queen on d8. All right, so let's quickly go back through the game. This was, Mike resigned after knight g5 check, which was the 20th move, which I think qualifies this game as what they call a miniature. So one thing that this game shows is that even against very strong players, you can win quickly if you play energetically enough. But let's go back and try to find some improvements for black. The first one, I think, is an alternative to the move knight d7. If black had been very focused on the fact that white has this weakness on d5, and if black had been cognizant of the fact that white might want to play e6 as soon as a knight shows up on d7, I think a different move would have presented itself to him, and that is the move bishop to d5. Okay, so black occupies this d5 square. He guards against the move e6, because now he can just take it with his bishop, and it's just a clean pawn. And black is now able to put his knight on d7, maybe at some point play c5 as a way of breaking down the white pawn center. Maybe instead the knight will make its way to d5. Maybe a pawn will be put on c6, which will anchor the bishop on d5. Black has all sorts of options, and I think this is how the game should have continued. So knight d7 already puts black, I think, in hot water after e6, and he has to play pretty precisely in order to avoid getting crushed. And then, as I mentioned before, after knight to g5, rook f6, queen h3, h6, knight f3, black has to try g5 instead of king h7. All right, so there wasn't a lot of instructive content in this video, but it was much shorter. We'll see what you think. No cats this time, so I'll probably get 2 views. We'll see. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to making more in the future. I think what I'm also going to do is use this channel as a way to create videos for some of my chess students that will serve as reminders of whatever we talked about in a lesson. At least that's what I'm kind of tentatively planning. All right, thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.